day five of our discussion. So we're day five out of 7. So we're just beyond the halfway point in this marathon. And today Antoine will be presenting. I think the format that he suggested is actually we go straight into discussions afterwards rather than getting feedback from myself and Marrikka. I should point out that Sanford Kwinter is not here today, unfortunately, because he's examining a PhD student, as indeed Antoine will be on the 3rd. So, but we have a support team here, which is wonderful. The other comment that I'd make before we start is that we have an online platform that's been established as a chat space for everyone. That's already active, and it's so far been accessed only by those who are active students. In other words, not those auditing, not those who are watching it streamed through YouTube. So we will endeavor to get the information to everybody so everyone can join in. It's fantastic to think that this whole theory workshop will have an afterlife in some kind of platform that will continue on into the future. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand you all over to Antoine. Welcome, Antoine.
Thank you, Neil. And let me start by sharing my screen. Share. So that's it. Sorry. And these. Okay. Sound is okay? Because I'm all by myself in the countryside, so I have sometimes the impression I'm a crazy guy lecturing to himself. Okay. Hi, everyone. So in this second lecture, I'd like actually to return in greater detail to a number of issues that I briefly evoked, more or less briefly, in my first presentation last Sunday. The issue of what it means for us humans to have an embodied form of intelligence will play a central role. It will be actually today less about artificial intelligence than about intelligence in design in general. And as previously, I'm struck actually by the fact that Neil, Sanford, and I, despite our sometimes striking disagreement, seem to be revolving around a number of common questions. So I will today introduce the notion of materiality, envisaged in a way that does not always correspond to the common definition. Materiality is often taken as something granted, as an objective dimension, especially in design. And I will argue to the contrary that it's actually a complex construct, that it's inseparable from culture. And the main argument today is that in order to understand better design intelligence, it might be useful to deal with what I've called the materiality of architecture. And for me, this is also a dimension of architecture that is also among those that enable design to be truly political by its own means. I'll touch very briefly on that, but this is something I've been working for a while on. I mentioned a number of times the need for design to be political, especially in relation to the design tool and artificial intelligence, and materiality may offer some clues about how to do that. So this is partly based on my book, La Materialité de l'Architecture, which was published in French in 2018, and a considerably expanded version will be published in English in 2021. What I've done today is actually a bit different. I've tried to extend the reflection rather than just repeat myself. So this is not a fully cooked talk, and I hope that you will be forgiving, even if, please, do not hesitate to point the incoherence. Before dealing with this notion of materiality, I'd like to begin by the question of intelligence in design, or more specifically, intelligence in architecture. So where does the intelligence in architecture lie? The discipline, at least in its Western definition, and we talked a lot about Alberti last time, I'm not going to necessarily invoke Alberti in depth, but the discipline was founded on a very specific answer that emerged at the Renaissance. So to make a complex story short, architectural intelligence was fundamentally in the mind of the designer. It was about ordering matter in a manner that enabled the designer to express his idea, his disegno. So in Italian, disegno was meant as an intellectual production, generally expressed through graphic means, and this is the beginning of a new status for drawing. As you also all know, it was supposed to separate the designer drastically from the workers that toiled on the construction site. So very different from, the way in which medieval master builders had not seen themselves as radically separate from workers. They saw rather themselves as on top of the food chain of the workers on the construction site, but not as belonging to a completely different category. This split is what the Renaissance achieved, and you've all learned, read, whatever, that the architect defined itself as an intellectual instead of a manual person. Of course, it was never completely easy to do that. I'll return to that, but let's just state one thing. To characterize disegno as an intellectual production seems simple, but it was actually a very complex and ambiguous answer to the question of design intelligence. First, because disegno meant idea and something that was relatively static, but it was also imbued with a dynamic intention, because it was also the desire to express this idea. And in French, actually, the Italian term disegno got translated in two terms. One, which was the drawing, dessin, which was actually the picture of the idea, and the other was dessin with an E and an I, which was actually the intention. So this was already, from the start, a complicated thing. But above all, let's ask a very naive question. If architecture was all about idea, why was materialization necessary? So the answer was, of course, that humans have a body, but it's actually there again quite a falsely simple answer. Well, it's falsely simple because what body are we talking exactly of? Because the body appeared as a dual reality in architecture. There was the ideal body that served as a measure of all things, a universe in small, hence the idea of the macrocosm and microcosm, and with the idea that the complexity of the universe was in some ways reflected in the complexity and the harmony of the human body. And there was then the real body plagued by all kinds of disease, etc., that led usually a far less exalted life. It's very striking how from the start, design intelligence seemed to address primarily the ideal body. Architecture very seldom designed for real bodies. And at a time, by the way, in which people were still plagued by a number of diseases, compared to which the coronavirus is actually a pretty healthy condition. So, and this ideal body, as expressed, for example, by Leonardo in his famous drawing on the Vitruvian Man, permeated the key notion of proportion and order. As you, there again, all know, order and proportion, the core principle of discipline, at least until the 18th century, were supposed to be in direct relation with this ideal vision of the body. And this is the perspective from which the Ionic column, for example, referred itself to the female body, the Doric to the male body, etc., etc. So because of this embodiment, architecture dealt with matter. Another way to put it, on which I return again and again, was that it ordered matter, submitted it to the domination of the disegno, the idea, and the intention to realize it. But matter submitted the disegno to specific constraint. One could not realize the same things in stone and in brick. So what was by the end the status of matter? Was it like this opacity that veiled the purity of ideas in the Platonic school of thought? But why this obstacle? Were material constraints comparable to the burden that humans had to support once expelled from the Garden of Eden, if one follows the Christian tradition? So actually, past the initial assimilation of design to a purely intellectual endeavor, a lot of nagging questions emerged. What was the exact role of matter in the shaping of the architectural idea? What about the body? The Vitruvian tradition that stemmed from the rediscovery of Vitruvius' writings at the end of the Middle Ages was never able to fully answer these questions, despite the fact that Renaissance and Baroque architecture did address them in practice, often with great subtleties, but actually were never completely and fully theorized. And actually, I would argue that, among the paradoxes of architecture is that it's a discipline that for a very, very long time has not actually had a clear idea of why matter mattered, so to say. So, and also had no absolute clear notion of what status did the body play past, this kind of idealization of the body. So that remained actually true for a very long time. There, of course, if you look at the history of architecture, there are discordant voices. For example, John Ruskin is among these voices. For him, matter and the body were essential to architecture. I think if there is one thing to retain from Ruskin, it's the role played by matter and materials. And I think it's not a coincidence that his main book is actually entitled The Stones of Venice. Ruskin also marked a radical attempt to break from the notion that design intelligence was mostly about the designer as separate from workers. And ornament, for him, as an indissociably spiritual and material endeavor, as something that owed at least as much, if not to the spirit and the hand of the worker, than to the mind of the designers, epitomized this ambition to radically delocalize design intelligence. So let me be clear. In practice, for centuries, architects knew that actually design intelligence was not only in their mind, that, for example, all the craftsmen who toiled on their construction site, they had an input in the design. But this was generally not recognized, and one could argue that actually part of what the Vitruvian-inspired theory was about was actually to limit the prerogative of the others in the design process. And Ruskin is probably one of the first to try actually to really engage with the idea that actually design intelligence is distributed. There were, of course, other attempts to do that. They remained overall rare. And by the end, I would argue that the ambiguity that had plagued the Vitruvian tradition would still characterize the modernist movement. It's, by the way, very striking to see how modernism remained faithful to an idealized vision of the body. Think, for example, of Le Corbusier modular, in which, by the way, the measure of this ideal body and the measure of nature and the cosmos are supposed to be in harmony. So I mentioned briefly phenomenology in my last presentation. One of the reasons I still have some sympathy for it is that it has tried to address this essential dimension of architecture that are matter, or rather the experience of matter, and of course the body. As I said last time, I don't necessarily appreciate the fixist vision of nature and the human posited by phenomenology, nor its often superficial rejection of technology, but I think this is one of the few schools that has tried to address these things. Okay, so far? So let me move to the second part of this thing, which is the digital in architecture, matter, and the body. So when the digital began to transform the architectural discipline, let's say at the turn of the 1990s, paperless studios, mid-1990s, and it's really at the end of the 1990s, some 20 years ago, that it really began to spread. And many critics at the time interpreted it as a dramatic intensification of the intellectual bent that had mostly characterized Western architecture since the Renaissance. And according to these critics, the use of the computer would accentuate the assimilation of architecture to a purely intellectual endeavor. And going even further, a number of people were very severe with the digital, saying, you know, the digital is going to dematerialize design. Was, by the way, they were a little bit helped by pioneer of the digital culture in architecture and the urban, like Bill Mitchell, who wrote in City of Bits that the future of design lied in was actually about ordering the online world and not necessarily building in bricks, etc. And so this kind of question is among the reasons that prompted actually Kenneth Frampton to write his book on tectonics. Actually, the subtext of Frampton's book is actually a critique of the digital in architecture. And Frampton, by the way, if you read the book as an historian, greatly exaggerated the role played by matter and the body in modernist architecture, but let's not enter into those details right now. So now, what happened, as we all know, and we wouldn't be here today if it had not happened, is a much more complex evolution than this process of dematerialization. And actually, it's not what has happened. So I said it's complex because actually the rise of the digital in architecture coincide with a series of other major evolution that all have to do with this topic. So let me briefly try to evoke some of them. And some of them are, of course, very much, you know, also Neil has talked about them, etc. First thing is, of course, a change in our vision of matter. With the idea that we're no longer in the kind of Cartesian passive vision of matter, but matter as inherently active, matter as the siege of spontaneous process of auto-organization, matter as something that it enables the creation of order, more thermodynamic, if you want, vision, etc. And key notions like emergence are very emblematic of this shift. In some ways, you know, it is a very fundamental phenomenon that, you know, you can trace it already with books like The New Alliance in the 1980s, and it has gone further and further. Second thing, which is often completely forgotten, by the way, by most theorists, is a revolution in materials. You know, materials used to be these things that were processed and sometimes could be very complex. You know, even producing cement is a much more complex process than what people usually imagine, but actually was still simple compared to what we can do today. And today we can really design material with a greater and greater precision. We can imbue materials with properties that used to be contradictory. For example, transparent did not go into making power. Today, we can combine both. We can combine a lot of things using actually digital tools very often. We can be inspired by nature in much more complex ways. So actually, we are in the middle of a revolution in materials that has been going on for the past at least 20 to 30 years, and of which very few things are usually said. It's very striking. Of course, this is a revolution that is problematic in many respects. For example, composite materials are very hard to recycle. That said, they are central to a number of technologies. So another evolution. Third evolution, more in the kind of intellectual world or the world of the humanities and the social sciences, what has been often called the material turn, which is, hey, guess what? We've paid too much attention to ideas, to representation, to what people have in their mind. We've not paid enough attention to the mediating role of material objects, of systems, etc., etc. There are a number of school of thought that has developed from those premises that we mentioned, actor network theory, and the unavoidable Bruno Latour, but also object-oriented ontology, and many other sub-discipline and methods have developed from that. And think also of the new materialisms, because with approval, because there are a lot of new materialisms, and Sanford was part of also of this adventure of the new materialism, etc. So that's a third evolution. So the first vision of matter and through matter of nature, a second, a revolution in materials, a third, this material turn in the humanities and social science, and finally, something that also plays a role, the rise of the post-human approach. So it has been a lot about cyborgs in the 1990s and 2000, but today we're probably more interested to things like distributed subjectivity, a subjectivity that may no longer be contained within the limits of the body, and that owes, of course, something to late cyberneticists, and we mentioned Gregory Bateson last time, but also let's think of the philosophy of Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze and this legacy. So with the idea that not only we're not only inside our body, but the inside of our body is a kind of outside, and the brain is not a single integrated machine like traditional vision, but it's actually a network, and a network of modules that dialogue, and actually so it's a kind of giant internal outside. So these evolution, I would say these four evolution, vision of matter, revolution in materials, the material turn in culture, and the rise of the post-human, they are interconnected. They are actually interconnected. Some may be more visible to you than others. The post-human is usually more broadly recognized. The revolution in materials is very often less appreciated what it is, but they all are connected, and they have all had an impact on the digital revolution in architecture. And I would argue that this has led to a powerful rematerialization of architecture, pretty much a kind of in the reverse from what initial critiques of digital architecture had forecast. So this rematerialization means that never has the material dimension of architecture been so intensely scrutinized. And with a number, by the way, of very important shifts. For example, a rejection of the traditional attitude according to which the designer imposed from outside a form on matter. Following theorists like the Deleuze-indebted anthropologist Tim Ingold, many designers have insisted on the need to cooperate rather than fight against matter, to substitute complicity to conflict. This has led, for example, to the renewed interest in the figure of the craftsman, hence the success of the eponymous book of Richard Sennett. Fabrication is, of course, part of this general movement. It's quite interesting, by the way, that notions such as material computation are indebted, of course, to the change in our vision of nature, but also to the revolution in materials and a number of other things. So digital architecture and fabrication are intimately connected to all these various evolutions I've mentioned. And it's also quite interesting to note that ornament and the so-called return of ornament is an expression of this kind of importance, country importance of matter. Today's ornament is very much about matter, to the point that it has actually often abandoned the claim to be symbolic, something that I have criticized again and again, because I actually think this is a dead end, but I may be wrong. So this rematerialization is, of course, inseparable from all sorts of inquiries regarding the relation of digital architecture to the question of the post-human. And the home for cyborg question has become quite general. And, just remember that Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley, who were always surfing on the latest wave, did organize a biennale on that theme in Istanbul. And since the post-human questions the body, and its traditional humanistic integrity, not only has matter returned very strongly to the forefront, but also the body. So far, so good. It's as if, finally digital architecture has achieved what hundreds of years of Vitruvian tradition, what the modernist movement, what all these past moments of the discipline had failed to do, to really take into account centrally matter and the body. But I mentioned at the beginning that I think it's a complex evolution that has taken place. I would argue that matter and bodies remain plagued by ambiguities. Take the claim, for example, that we are in a period marked by a spectacular rejection of philomorphism. In other words, that we are no longer imposing an arbitrary form on matter. And you have all these digital craftsmen, etc., claiming that they have this sympathy for matter, etc., that claim that, contrary to traditional authoritarian attitude, concrete design is very much about, playing with the spontaneity of matter. But actually, you could argue that 3D printing is the most spectacular form of philomorphism. Digital fabrication separates dramatically information from matter, instead of letting information appear through cooperation with matter. So I would argue that at this stage that there is actually some kind of strange nostalgia permeating the digital discourse. The digital has actually, in many, many cases, radically separated information from matter, and it dreams at the same time of reuniting them. It's not without analogy with another paradoxical thing, which is our longing for the continuous. We've borrowed to Deleuze and his followers, a kind of accent put on continuity. We talked at some point on the rejection of the void that modernists try to install between objects. So everything is in continuity with everything, but at the same time, the digital is actually all about discretization, all about discontinuity. So it's good to be reminded that every revolution does not only look towards the future, it generates its own form of nostalgia. For example, the Enlightenment, who completely revolutionized the vision of society, the idea of secularized the world, and is very often said, substituting to the sovereignty of the king anointed by God or whatever, the idea that the people was the sovereign. The Enlightenment was marked by a number of very nostalgic moments. For example, it's during the Enlightenment that began to appear the idea that never would art be as good and authentic as when the Greek had practiced it. That authenticity had been lost forever. And all that you could do is to be desperately trying to recreate this authenticity that was at the same time impossible to gain. That is the neoclassical drama, when the sculptor, the Danish sculptor Thors Valsen, is doing, for example, these Greek-like statues. He's at the same time convinced that he cannot be Greek and will never able to recapture the true spirit, the true enthusiasm of the beginning of the art. By the way, when you read Heidegger, there is, of course, still very much a trace of this, this idea that the dawn of culture is also its moment of greatest brilliance. So another form of nostalgia that appeared in industrial England was the longing for medieval collective creation, which was, by the way, partly a myth, but nevertheless, this is, the idea that the construction site of the cathedral were intense moments of popular cooperation, etc., etc. And this is where Ruskin and the arts and craft come into the picture. So without even realizing it, we are permeated by nostalgia. The only difference I would make is that it's maybe not a nostalgia of the past, but a nostalgia of the pure vibrancy of the world that we are unable to be fully plugged in. As if, we were not, I think we are in a period of so-called intense materialism, but intense doubt on the fact that we can ever be material enough. And as if it was, once again, a nostalgia of the present, of the intensity of the present, as if we could never be present enough. But let me move on. Matter, complicated issue. If we look now at the body, there are similar ambiguities. We have, for example, dramatically rejected the Cartesian dualism, and it's very bad to the Cartesian to separate mind and body, etc., etc. But there is the risk, and I was quite struck by the fact that we did not really discuss it so far, or perhaps once I left yesterday, that artificial intelligence will actually lead to an even more severe form of dualism, since we have now a disembodied form of intelligence that has become possible. Through our cooperation with this disembodied form of intelligence, for this is what a number of people really dream of, we might finally achieve the status of angels. That is, pure figure of communication, forsaking our physical limitation. It's good to remember, after Michel Serres and others, that angels are actually figure of communication. They relate the heaven and the earth, the God and the humans, etc., etc. And in some ways, aren't we dreaming of becoming angels? This is, for me, what the singularity, this is what strikes me most with Kurzweil, that actually the dream of Kurzweil is that we become like angels, this kind of, once we're able to upload ourselves in machines. Another way to approach the question would be to note that the posthuman is often recreating a kind of ideal body, no longer the Da Vinci Vitruvian man or Michelangelo David, but the cyborg as a new normative figure. And the posthuman actually indulges still in a lot of idealization. And the cyborg, I would argue, is a hybrid very similar in some ways to the angel, a figure of the mediation, and hybrid that mediates not necessarily between God and humans, but between human and technology, or between nature and the artificial. And finally, there are bodies missing in the count. These guys seem to have completely disappeared from the picture, as if they no longer exist. And by the way, the dream is to replace them by orange robotic arm, keep the color, leave the body. And it's extraordinary to observe how today's craze for the craftsman is actually not about real craftsmanship, but about the overarching power of the digitally equipped designers. There are exceptions. For example, there is a practice in Australia who's been working more on a kind of cyborg worker in an interesting way. But most of the time, these guys are forgotten. So where do I want to go? That there are powerful factors of change in our country moments. There is indeed a renewed interest for the material dimension. There is indeed an interest for the physical, the body, etc. By the same token, also, we have a lot of confused feeling that things could change. For example, that we could overcome once and the traditional limit of authorship, which is a little bit what Neil suggested at some point about the death of the architect or the rebirth of the architect. Perhaps, by the way, we're thinking, yes, after your talk yesterday, that the rebirth of the architect could be a better title. This is actually what you have in mind. And more generally, the idea that, we have to think differently about or change about subjectivity, about authorship, to better include the fact that we have changing identities and bodies. So let me be clear. I worked a lot on utopia because probably I'm not very utopian. That's why I always envy utopians. I don't think we'll ever get there. Once again, I don't believe in dialectics, but I believe in the unresolved character of the world. So for me, I think design will probably continue very often to deny matter and bodies as well while doing the reverse. So what I'm going to present now is more a kind of opening. It's not a fix. I don't believe in remedy. It's not about, this is the way we should do things. It's just an alternate way to read all that, which I hope will be of interest to you, and might lead to an alternate way also to approach what design intelligence might mean. Because if there is, in the middle of all my doubts, one thing I'm persuaded is that we need to enlarge design intelligence once and for good, not to replace star designers. Contrary to Neil, I believe still we'll have a very strong hierarchy. The people who design opera houses will still be considered better as theorists. That's part of, the food chain in the field. But it doesn't matter. I think what does matter is to understand design intelligence in a broader way, which will also enable us to welcome artificial intelligence in a more productive way. So now I'm going to talk about this bizarre notion of materiality that I've been using. And well, I hope not to be too long, but I thought that would not be too long. No, well, I'm going to rush. But okay, so what do I mean by these terms? So let's return from a very down-to-earth standpoint, which is often what I tend to do. Why do you pay an architect? You pay an architect not to bring you a ton of bricks, cement, or whatever. You pay actually an architect to order it. An architect is the guy, the person who actually will order all these materials in order to produce, a house, whatever, you name it. So ordering is actually a very concrete problem. And architecture is inseparable, has used tools from the start. Why was proportion so valued? Because proportion is actually a tool to order matter. Why did structure at a certain point emerge in the history of architectural thought? Because structure was another way to order matter. So now we believe in the perfectly objective realm. You pay an architect basically to put some order to all these heaps of materials to make walls, etc. But I would argue that ordering is inseparable from a strange expressive dimension. You could believe that this thing has nothing, is just pure engineering, but actually as soon, for example, as you begin to use proportion, questions related to analogies and even to the symbolic begin to emerge. And this is why from a very, very long time, proportion has usually given rise to all kinds of interpretative theories linked to their expressive power. Think also of the belief in the golden ratio, etc., etc. The same, amazingly, is even truer of structure. To the point that when, for example, Le Corbusier wants to get rid, Domino is a fantastic project which is based on the premises, let's start before architecture by thinking structurally, far before any aesthetic intention. And as Eisenman has brilliantly demonstrated in an article in, I think it was in any magazine a long time ago, actually what is striking is that while he does that, Le Corbusier cannot escape the question of architecture and architectural expression. So what do I mean by expression? That architecture is not only ordering matter, it puts it in a disposition that suggests that matter can address humans. That matter has, at the limit, something to say to humans, which explains why architecture has an extremely ambiguous relation to language. In the book, I've devoted pages and pages to that question. On the one hand, architecture at the limit would like to speak, but should it speak, it might no longer be architecture because, text speak, people speak. So what architecture does in between muteness and language is actually to animate matter. And you may remember I talked a lot about animation in my first talk, and architecture makes matter expressive by animating. So what I'm interested in all that stuff is that by the end, architecture revolves around the assumption that matter and humans can enter in a relation, that they share something, that they can exchange something, which is not a priori, even if you're the fiercest new materialist, it's not absolutely evident. So this is what I call materiality. So to be clear, materiality for me is not an entirely objective thing. When we say that something is material, it means that we have a certain type of relation to it. So I define materiality, so I won't enter into all this complexity of the definition, but as the regime of the various relation between the physical world and the human at a given moment in history in a given society. This is a regime that prescribes, among other things, what is supposed to be material as opposed to what is supposed to be immaterial. And let's not forget that material and immaterial, of course, I don't want to deny that some things are whatever the civilization materials, but actually the definition varies at the fringe, and this fringe does matter. And I would say that materiality organizes the tangible. So it's historically and socially determined. For example, in the Middle Ages, a lot of people saw miracles and a lot of strange physical phenomena that we no longer see today. To give you another example, which I use very often, in the 19th century, a lot of people thought that actually ghosts were actually material. You could measure them and you could take photos. This is an English guy. Always beware of the English that immigrate to America. They're very dangerous people. These guys made a fortune by photographing people with one of their beloved departed. So here you have the ghost of the departed between the two people who missed her a lot. So ghosts were material, and think of the number of physicists, etc., that try to measure spectral aura, etc., etc. So today, gradients of temperature, for example, have become more and more part of the tangible in architecture, to the point that architects like Philippe Ram or Iñaki Abalos and many others consider them as more important than walls. And there is a kind of tangibility to, atmospheric parameters that was not present to the same degree in traditional architecture. So all that to say that materiality is not a representation of matter. It's a regime of relation that includes representation, but includes a lot of practices, etc. And it includes a kind of concrete experience of the physical world. So materiality does depend, of course, on our belief, if we believe in ghosts or not, or whatever, on our science, but it depends also very much on our machines and what we do with them. For example, I've argued again and again that the automobile was one of the most powerful tools to reshape our relation to the physical world. It has completely reorganized the relation to the physical world. The computer, and one of my arguments is that until recently, if the computer has been a powerful tool to reshape our experience of the world. It's worth remembering that initially computer meant actually a machine to compute, then it meant a machine to reason, and then with the digital, it became a machine that radically reshaped our experience of the world. It reshaped vision, it reshaped audition, it reshaped hearing, it's reshaping smell, because we more and more, for example, compose perfume using computers, etc. So where do I want to go with all that? Question you may wonder. To the following, and I could go on, I could explain more details, all these materiality stuff, but the most important thing is actually this very austere, as an introduction, this very austere page. This is from an 18th century treatise by a philosopher called Condillac, who's a sensationalist philosopher, a disciple of John Locke. Was persuaded that most of the things we learn through our experience of the exterior world. I hope you're beginning to see where I want to go. And to try to speculate on that, Condillac had quite an interesting fiction to propose to his reader. So he imagined a statue, which was a living statue insofar that it could acquire knowledge and even eventually become self-aware, acquire consciousness. So you see, it had some kind of strange relation with artificial intelligence. And this statue, Condillac imagined that at the beginning, she has no sense at all, no vision, no hearing, no whatsoever. And then gradually he gives her vision, hearing, touch, smell, etc., etc. And Condillac trying to explain how, by receiving these capacity to these senses, she begin to evolve and gradually builds her subjectivity. So you might wonder, what is the crucial moment? And actually, the crucial moment is actually chapter 4, which is not about vision, not about hearing, not about smell, it's about touch. And Condillac explains that the statue, when she receives touch, it begins to touch around herself. And she realized that there is a material world that resists her tendency to push things, etc. And because of that, she begins to have a sensation that she might be both completely in this world and a subject in this world. So this is the beginning of a process that will lead her to self-awareness. So to go back to my issue of materiality from this Condillac, I'm not a disciple of Condillac, of course, but what I would propose is that materiality is always a process through which there is a kind of co-emergence of the physical world as we can experience it, and of ourselves as we can perceive ourselves, understand ourselves, etc. In other words, materiality is a process of co-emergence or co-construction of the physical world as something that you can experience in a tangible manner, and of the subject. To go back to the automobile, by the way, it's quite striking how the automobile was completely linked to a reshaping of our own sensation, but also our understanding of ourselves. Think, for example, of the exhilaration of being driving, feeling the acceleration in your body. All these things, had you say to this a 17th century guy, you're accelerating, would not have meant a lot. Accelerating was not the same thing. If I tell you you've been just given a Porsche, you're sitting in the voluptuous leather chair and you're accelerating, you can almost feel your bones when it beats. And oops, there was an accident. Then you realize that actually with the car, we've not only reshaped our body as this kind of glorious body of the age of mechanization, but also the vulnerable body who can get into an accident. So all that to say that materiality is something that engages both the way we perceive the world and the way we perceive ourselves, beginning with the body. So for me, the materiality of architecture revolves around that. It's never only about materials. It's never only about purely objective things. It is about the relation. It's a suggestion about the relation in which we can enter with the material world. So it is both about what is the world out there and what about us humans, or rather how we constitute ourselves in relation with our environment as both, and this is the paradox from which we'll never get rid completely. When I say I'm a Cartesian, I'm actually not a Cartesian, but there are moments in which we have to believe that we're distinct from the world, though knowing that we are actually completely inside it. So, and architecture is actually a play on that. It immerses us in a material world, and at the same time suggests that we are in a relation, and because we are in a relation, we're creating a difference. So Tadao, by the way, had exactly, and many other architects, he explains, for example, in one of his texts, the body articulates the world, and at the same time, the body is articulated by the world. When I perceive the concrete to be something cold and hard, I recognize the body as something warm and soft. So actually, architecture is this kind of dynamic co-production of of the physical world, an experience of the physical world and of all self. And this is, to go back to something that I've mentioned last time, this is what inhabiting means for me ultimately. It's a proposal about what is the world out there and why does this world why does it matter to me in a very literal sense? Why am I concerned with it? And the task of architecture is actually to create places in which what humans do and says matters, like scenes. And so arranging matter so that the sympathy that may exist, or the kind of co-construction between matter and humans, suggests that actually what humans do may have a relevance. And this, in some ways, architecture is staging humans. And this is, for me, by the way, how design can be truly political, so by its own means. And I've been reflecting in the past month on two notions. The first, just to finish, what is this about? It's about materials, but it's about, hey, you have a place in this world. This carol is waiting for you. The light and the shadow, etc., makes a world that has a sense for humans. And when Kant says very simply, a library, it's a person who takes a book and goes towards the light. This is very much what he means. And of course, the brick, the wood, the light, obscurity, all that is essential. So how can design be political by its own means? By organizing these seeds, etc. And I've suggested two modes. One, which is what I call situation. I've borrowed that to one of my colleagues, Rahul Mehrotra. It's so-called an intelligent facade for India. But what is very striking in this facade, it's intelligent insofar that the garden is tended by real people, which are still the most intelligent creature we can meet. But these people are actually from a very low caste, very low status, and very different from the people on the other side of the glass, who are, very high caste people in high tech, etc. What the building forces them actually to do is not to become friends, but to see each other. And if we relate that to Rancière's regime, aesthetic regime, which have a link for me to regime of materiality, this is typically a situation that architecture can produce. So, and the other notion for me is decor, which is a strange thing. I've thought more and more about the symbolic. There is a famous text by Victor Hugo in which he explains that the cathedral was a text, was like a book. Actually, I don't think a cathedral was a book. It was a decor. And a decor is linked to decorum, and decorum has to do with social order. So a decor is a place in which some social rituals can take place. And giving the impression, and it's not necessarily useful for you to know all that is represented. All that matters is to understand that something is represented that has a human relevance. So I'm nearing my conclusion. So where do I want to go with all that? So final thing, for me, the central question today is, what does inhabiting mean in today's world? Which means it's not only and it's a question that involves our relation to materials and matter, but also who we are. So let me go back to what I said at the beginning. Where is design intelligence? Is it only in the creative mind of the designers as the capacity to envision something? I think one of the interests of the rise of the digital and AI, if we do it properly, that is to recognize that intelligence is actually distributed. The biggest danger with AI would be actually just to ally oneself to AI to try to be enhanced, become superhuman or post-human in a kind of heroic way, which is, for me, the biggest problem with quote-style approach. It's the old hubris of the human, trying desperately to be a superhero. So, and that's, for me, one of the danger, which is, by the way, because of that danger that people are so afraid of AI, because, of course, if you want to be superhuman, there is also the risk to be infrahuman, and that AI is going, by the end, to be the only true superhero. So what if instead of that, we envisage a distribution? of design intelligence. But then we have to go further, and the reason I introduced the notion of materiality is because intelligence, by the end, and this is the proof I'm not really completely a Cartesian, must be as much in the matter of architecture than in the minds of the designer. And it might be above all also in the mind of the inhabitant. And it is actually in all these things together. And for me, a regime of materiality, since it's something that enables, that explains what kind of relation may exist between the material, the subjective, and the question of architecture, is actually a distribution of this idea of intelligence. Knowing, by the way, that inhabiting is a complex notion. It's not a simple notion, because part of it is actually completely animal, yeah, and I forgot also to say that, this should include the workers. And by the way, good old Core, by the end of his life, was interested in reintroducing the worker. Like when, for example, was completely enthusiastic on the full work left by the hand of the worker in his brutalist periods, very Ruskinian. But, to go back to inhabiting, part of inhabiting is actually animal. Termites inhabit. So birds create nests, etc. So I think part of the complexity is not only to be nested, but also to forge oneself an identity and a destiny. And I think in some ways, architecture is a platform to enable the rise of this fiction among all the fiction that we're human beings. I'm not sure that we are human. I'm sure that we're dreaming that we're humans. And both involve matter and bodies. And speaking of dreaming, this is why I say idealization will never be completely abandoned. There is always a process of idealization in architecture. I do think that we have to enlarge the notion of design intelligence, and then perhaps the question of the machine might not be as dramatic as today. Once we've recognized, and this echoes a little bit the death or the rebirth of the architect of yesterday, once we have abandoned this localization of design intelligence solely in the designer's mind, then we can realize that there is actually a lot of space for other actors. And of course, I'll go back to the same picture I used last time as conclusion. Beyond the design process, the real question of AI regards how it will impact inhabiting. That's for me also one of the central questions today. And with that, I'm done with my second speech. Oof. Okay, please, as I say, it's not a fully cooked thing, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can start the conversation. And of course, Neil and Marrikka just jump in, but why don't we open it to everyone to see how it goes, and then we can jump in. So what I will, can someone, is the Digital Future host still there?
Ciao.
Can you moderate? Yes, sure.
Could I just say something? I don't want to contradict or contest what
beware, Neil.
I'm going to steer clear of the political side of things. I've a book called The Politics of Space that I'm in the process of writing. It's been delayed for a long time, and I've written about the political, and I don't subscribe to Rancière so much. Anyway, I'll leave that aside. I take a, well, here's my position. I wrote an article called Matter Matters for Skylar Tibbets in a book called Active Matter, and I've uploaded that into the or had Chow upload that into our kind of folder of readings and things. So my position would be there are actually two forms of computation. There is a digital computation. There's also material computation, whereby matter computes itself. You think of a sand dune, for example, and the way that the force of the wind on the grains of sand distribute the grains, and so the sand dune, although it might be beautiful, is actually simply a result of material forces. Now, I guess I take my my starting point. Well, actually, it's in Vitruvius already in some senses. Firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. Firmitas being structural stability, utilitas being kind of usefulness, and then venustas being charm. It's not beauty, it's charm. But anyway, so there's a distinction between a kind of performance and appearance there. The way it's articulated to me much more clearly is actually in the work of Deleuze, in 1000 Plateaux, in the chapter on the war machine, where he distinguishes two different sensibilities. Now, he's not talking about architecture, but he uses architecture as an example. And he talks about the difference between the, he calls it the Romanesque and the Gothic. Actually, the Romanesque, I think, broadly means the classical. And he's making the distinction between one regime, which is really about representation, symbols, meaning, and so on. The world of the classical, of the Renaissance, and so on, which is largely a visual realm, where you're subscribing to visual templates, such as proportions. And then the Gothic, which of course is not just simply the Gothic as such, but let's say the Gothic spirit that gets re-articulated more recently in the work of people like Gaudi and Fray Otto. I would also argue Achimenges and a whole bunch of other people who are interested in kind of morphogenesis. And that's a very different way of thinking about things. It's about understanding process, understanding forces, flows, how material is informed in some ways. So it's less about a representational discourse and more about a kind of performance discourse. And I think that's crucial. And at one point I wrote an article, I forget the title of it now, it was a paper at Acadia, where I was criticizing O, because I think O really kind of, just by focusing on a representational discourse, miss out this important aspect of material performance. I think typically we have this, we think of Learning from Las Vegas as being a really famous book in the history of architecture. I find it really quite banal, that book, and kind of pointless. But the book I do find incredibly interesting is Manuel de Landa's book, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. Now, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, where for me it kind of blew my mind at the time when I'd been brought up in this kind of phenomenological world where if we spoke about materials, it was not really about materiality materials, it was about the poetics of materials. And I found that deeply disturbing. And there was no discourse of engineering or structure at all. And in fact, as I mentioned yesterday, at Cambridge, the School of Architecture was right in front of the School of Engineering, and there was no communication, zero communication between the two. So what de Landa brought in, which I think was an incredibly important thing, because all the effort in terms of kind of theory had been going somewhere else, he brought in the world of science and technology and a material itself as a territory to be theorized. And I think that was an important gesture. So to my mind, in that article, I was comparing Learning from Las Vegas and de Landa, and I think de Landa has made a huge contribution towards that. And that was certainly the basis of what I was writing at the time. So I think just in terms of the digital, okay, so there is a difference obviously between these two. I mean, to my mind, the big mistake that that is made by both Mario Carpo and Gilles Retzin is thinking that the digital is material. It is not. In fact, actually, we talk about, I made the mistake, I have a book called Digital Fabrication, but actually the digital is completely immaterial.
Neil, do you want to give another lecture, or
no, I kind of finish my point. My point, and the point being this is that what we actually have is digitally controlled fabrication, because actually what happens with robotic fabrication is actually the very similar things that we were doing before. So layered 3D printing is not different to bricklaying, in a sense. It is simply, so I think the fabrication side is completely analog. So if you take up the term discrete and somehow read that, and the digital is discrete, but that doesn't mean to say it's a form or more material in any way. Or if you take the word big data, it doesn't mean to say forms of big data, it's information. So I think, anyway, there's a lot of confusion going on there. So I would want to distinguish between those two realms. Now, what you do get, I mean, there was, I think, going back to Frampton, his point, it was kind of interesting to see the debate that Frampton was talking about in tectonics. one way to interpret it, which is probably the wrong way, is to see that when that book was published in the early 90s in Columbia, it was when all the ideas about computation were coming in, and one could maybe think that his book was almost intended as a critique of computation. And certainly there was a big divide going on in Columbia between Bernard Tschumi and his kind of computational architects and Frampton, a big divide. So it was almost like, because the computation couldn't understand materiality, he was arguing for tectonics. Now, deliberately, therefore, when I published a book called Digital Tectonics, was also a conference, I called it Digital Tectonics as a way to show that actually the computation could inform the tectonics. You could use computational models to model the behavior. And I think that's the point, is in a sense, it's about modeling it. It's not the actual thing itself. So what you often get now with AI are digital twins. They produce a digital model to kind of model, to understand the performance of a building. So it's not a physical model, it's a digital model, it's a digital twin. But the point is, I guess, is that you can understand and you can model behaviors in a very intelligent way. So in that conference, Digital Tectonics, where we brought together people like Cecil Baumann, who at the time was a really kind of a cult figure in engineering, with Manuel de Landa, with Greg Lynn.
Now, to be honest, Greg Baumann was never a figure in engineering. Let me correct that. But he's an engineer for architect, just like you have a hairdresser for dogs.
Yeah. Can I finish? And also,
let's be honest. I don't know where you want to go. Honestly, it looks a little bit like Kwinter yesterday. So could you summarize what is your point of opposition?
So I think this is the point. I'll come back to what I think I might have mentioned yesterday, was that de Landa kind of said that he felt that he was surrounded by material philosophers. And I think that in a way, that's what's been absent in a lot of architectural discourse, is understanding materiality. I think there are many forms of intelligence in architecture, and the book that's just coming out called Architecture Intelligence, I try to provide a manifesto. To my mind, there is a design intelligence. There's also material intelligence, there's structural intelligence, there's environmental intelligence, and so on. In fact, I would say that that's kind of been uploaded into architecture. So now that is what architecture is, increasingly a question of intelligence applied in many different sort of discourses. So from that point of view, I completely agree with the design intelligence as a kind of a thesis. But I guess I would want to sort of celebrate the Gothic, the kind of material, the understanding of morphogenesis. Anyway, I also put up digital morphogenesis as an article in the folder. Okay.
So you don't have really an opposition. So that's disappointing.
No, I wasn't trying to. To
be honest, it's true that I've always these very historical bands. So for me, de Landa, yourself, me, we're part of history. So actually the new materialism for me is a historical moment, which is constitutive. Actually, the book is very much on the idea, what is the new regime of materiality that has accompanied. And for me, the structural, but I don't distinguish between structural, etc. I actually think that regimes of materiality are pretty large and encompassing things. So simply for me, de Landa, by the way, or Kwinter, or etc., they're symptoms of something that has changed in the culture, and something that itself has linked to what has happened in architecture. But what I propose is, why don't we try to have questions from the audience or reaction or whatever? I saw a couple. I'm not very good at reading at the same time as trying to pretend that I'm addressing an audience. So, if you want to ask question, yes, I see Prava Kandekar. So why don't you unmute and raise?
We need to unmute him. Chao, can you do that?
Perfect. So am I audible?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. All right. So firstly, greetings from India, and it's a great pleasure. Well, mine is some sort of a reaction, then I see it as an explicit question to the panel. But what brings me here is a contemplation and my deep association to Indian classical music, and especially an introspection that I've always had about the act of real-time composition and generative thinking and improvisation during a performance. So I would like to elaborate a bit on this moment where the process of composition as it unfolds, it acknowledges, it negotiates, and it incorporates the continually becoming present, so to say. And that is ultimately brought to public consciousness. That is what we call as the performance. And well, while this happens, there comes a certain threshold, which I would like to emphasize and probably scrutinize a bit, that the threshold at which the composition transcends its materiality and shares its presence with the immaterial, that is the signification of the melody or the song. And this is the moment what I would like to call as a state of liminality, that it has transcended the state of the materiality, and it has jumped towards an immaterial signification. And that is indeed at that moment what constitutes the conversation that Professor Antoine had described, that it is not merely the communication, but the signification of the song or the composition is what converses with the audience. And especially in Indian classical music, where spatially and temporally the improvisation keeps going on. So I would rather at this moment I would like to invoke Morris Cohen. At just a moment, I have quote.
We've lost you.
Yeah. I'm on the line. I really want to invoke this philosopher called Morris Cohen, that I would like just a matter of a moment. Well, yes. What he says is that anything acquires meaning if it is connected with or indicates or refers to something beyond itself, so that its full nature points to and is revealed in that connection. It's a quote by Morris Cohen. So this is what I would probably would like to scrutinize, the moment of liminality, when the material transcends its material realm towards an immaterial domain. So this is kind of the frame that what I associate very strongly through my association with Indian classical music. And it is, yeah, so probably, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
No, I find it interesting that we are in this return of this idea of music. I think Sanford would be actually probably more apt to answer to you, because he's thought a lot about the relation between design and music. But in some ways, this is also why the craftsman, one of the figure convoked by Richard Sennett is actually the musician, and the way the musician create, which is very different, by the way, in the way Renaissance and Baroque architect understood the relation to music, which had more to do with composition. And the return to improvisation is quite interesting today. So thank you very much.
Antoine,
other?
Can I add something to that, Antoine? I think I'm not someone to talk about music at all, but I do think one has to make a distinction between meaning and meaningfulness. I mean, typically in the history of architecture, well, in Rethinking Architecture, for example, there are sections on phenomenology and structuralism. Now, these actually were in many ways counterposed. So structuralism semiology was about how you read things, how you read the meaning into a building. For example, Roland Barthes writes about the Eiffel Tower, what's the meaning of the Eiffel Tower, and so on. Whereas the phenomenological tradition was about meaningfulness. So you can contrast the idea of reading a text and experiencing the texture, So they're two different discourses. And I would have thought that possibly music would go into the kind of question of meaningfulness. Obviously, there are lyrics in a song that mean something literally, but I thought it'd be more about the experience of the music itself. So that's a little distinction that I think I would introduce there. But that's what all I would add.
All right, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to jump in? Otherwise, I just give back
Oh
the
yes,
microphone to
there's
Leah.
one. There's Victoria, Yuzui Babel.
Yes, hi. Can you
Victoria,
hear me?
yes.
Hi.
Please.
So this is I'm trying to be very concise. This just came up in my mind, so I hope to make sense. Responding to Antoine's point of inhabiting and forging of identity, I think it's a very important and interesting point in architecture. And I think, you know, it brings up the point and the question if maybe we as architects are engaging in a process of ordering phenomena around us and thus familiarizing the environment around us to other people. And we take ourselves as a baseline in some way, like going back to this ideal body versus the real body. And so it becomes a compression and expansion of the field of phenomena that the human is exposed to. And so in a way, when you look at a phenomenon that's called neural entrainment in neurology, which basically means that you order the environment based on definitions of elements in the environment. So adult brains, for example, start seeing a door as a door, and they don't get caught up in the engagement with the fullness of the door. I mean, Deleuze would call it the virtual, right? But I think we as designers often engage in this process, and we take a moment longer sometimes to kind of debate the door, right? So I think maybe, and I don't know, maybe you think as well that this may be a moment for designers and thinkers that we could take to basically question design intelligence, because it brings up this point of, you know, neural diversity in our environment and in the group of people that we are designing for. So maybe it's a moment to pay attention to these margins and glitches, because we also think about them more in terms of AI, that might open new opportunities for us. So maybe you can respond to that.
No, I quite agree. Just to, and by the way, thank you for the brevity. I love brevity, probably because I'm still very French. So in the 18th century, if you spoke for more than a quarter of an hour, you were severely punished in the salon. Thank you. No, I think there are a couple of fundamental questions for all that. I think one is definitely, I see AI and neuroscience, etc., as a way to realize that we are a diversity. So it's kind of Deleuzian, neo-Deleuzian. And because of that, that we can get rid of this idea of projecting simply our ego or idealized vision of it into design and designing for a kind of idealized version of ourselves. I think also that matter, the kind of return to material may offer an opportunity, because matter does not necessarily presuppose an ideal body. So I think it is a chance for design. In some ways, I'm calling for design to be, on the one hand, more material, you know, and on the, so that it can escape simplification, and at the same time, certainly more open to all those possibilities, neuroscience, AI, etc. So I don't want to make complete sense, but actually I quite agree with the things you said. So there is Iman, why don't you unmute?
Hi, and thanks to everyone. I've got a few questions. When Liam Young in Machine Landscape, the post-Anthropocene of architecture, mentioned there is a shift in our landscape, and he mentioned like the Amazon warehouse in comparison to the cathedral, and he faced us with the new inhabitants question. But my question is more precise. How do you see the new rise of ornaments in machine landscape, or or put it in a different word, we see the politic shape, the cathedral, with the ornament to connect to people, as you mentioned. But what's we face now is, as Liam Young stated, a machine landscape, the Amazon warehouse, the miner houses that are the face of the new technology, and it's not in their duty to make a dialogue between architecture and human. Their work is, yeah, I don't know, I could, mention, there are lots of things that could be mentioned. I don't see how the ornaments are shaping in these architectures.
Okay, well, I so happen I'm going to pay my Neil for 5 minutes. I wrote a book on ornament, so which is trying actually to understand a little bit what is the status of the country ornament. I would say a couple of things. The first is that, we live in a very ornamental period, in an ornamental period, and almost in a Krakauer ornament, in a Krakauer sense. That's to say, our society is highly ornamental, with a lot of decor, decoration, etc. And so I think, it doesn't mean that it's always architectural, but we live in a highly ornamental. Second, I do interpret ornament very much. I think ornament is very much linked to the rise of the material and the reshaping of subjectivity today. What is missing in country ornament is probably the political relevance that it had in former periods. Because for me, and this is where the question of the symbolic comes back, I'm not a postmodern, to be very clear, otherwise it would be difficult to be chairman of the Fondation Le Corbusier. But I do believe that the question of the symbolic is unavoidable in architecture, and digital architecture has done its best to avoid it so far. And if we want to be political, we need to go back to some aspect of the political. Decor, for example, is when ornament becomes a kind of framing. There is a theorist of ornament, Oleg Grabar, who's an historian of Islamic ornament, who wrote that the task of architecture is to frame and adorn human activities. And to frame and to adorn is precisely what traditional ornament was about. To frame as in suggesting that action take place in a meaningful arena, and to adorn, that's to say, to suggest that these actions have a meaning. So we're not yet there, but I'm confident that, I'm confident that at some point, country ornament will acquire maturity. So far, we're in a period of great immaturity of ornamentation, the ornamentation in architecture. Okay, so we can continue the conversation. I'm trying not to be too long. So I have someone who wants to raise your hand, Marina Rodriguez. And meanwhile, I have Sonia Bora. So why don't you, Sonia Bora?
You hear me?
Yes. Yes, if you have a camera and a good, I'd like to see people. It's always nicer. I can see Neil, for example. So when you ask the question, why don't you put your camera so I can see who is talking?
I'm very sorry about that, but today
if you don't have a good connection, just forget about it. But,
sorry about that. Yeah. Professor Picon, you spoke about intelligence. And I mean, I worry my question's a little bit philosophical, but I have to ask since it's you that's answering. But
I'm not as philosophical as Neil, so I will let perhaps Neil jump in if I'm not philosophical enough. He's a philosopher. Okay, but shoot.
Sure, I'll take any answer at all, really. But so when we speak about intelligence, I can't, I feel like ideas of subjectivity and objectivity come, they sort of come to the fore. And so when if we invoke epistemology and epistemological ideas, I feel like sometimes our ideas of objectivity also sometimes become subjective. And so in terms of artificial intelligence, I'm just wondering, where do these ideas of objectivity and subjectivity lie? I mean, are we expecting it to conform to our notions of it, or is there something else that we're expecting from it?
Okay, I'll let Neil then, but I would say it's hard to answer that question for a very simple reason, which is we don't have yet conscious AI.
Yeah.
Subjective and objective are categories which are inseparable. You know, it's a little bit like my story of the statue of Condillac. You know, the crucial moment is when you're able to say I, but I, which is accompanied, because a computer can say I, but I, which is accompanied by the consciousness, this fleeting moment in which you realize you're yourself, which is always a fleeting moment. But
Yeah.
so I think it's too early to know what's going to happen with the objective, the subjective.
I understand that, but since we were sort of discussing AI having conscience, so this question sort of came up and I felt compelled to ask.
I think it's going to be an interesting question, because you could imagine that AI, you know, the fact that we have a body, whether we're post-Cartesian or whatever, still, because we have a body, we move. You know, Sanford mentioned that yesterday. So we have a certain, and this is actually the source of why we've been creating all these fiction in which we're separate from the world. We could imagine, if I may just finish, you know, Neil, and then I'll let you. We could imagine an AI who, having no body, being truly distributed in networks, present, ubiquitously present, etc., will not distinguish between the world and herself. You know, because one of the sources of the reason we distinguish between the world and ourselves, the objective and the subjective, etc., is because we have the body. And we move from one place to another. You could very well imagine, and that would be a very disconcerting, it would be actually the attribute of God. You know, in 17th century, there, for example, you know, there is a 17th century French philosopher, Malebranche, who imagined that actually space was the sensorium of God. So you could imagine actually forms of intelligence in which actually there would be a confusion between the objective and the subjective, because they would be the world. You see what I mean?
Right. Yeah,
and that would be extremely disconcerting for us, because once again, it goes back to our own embodied, because we're embodied. We tend to create a separation between the world and us and look at objects in front of us. So an intelligence which is truly distributed could perhaps see things differently, but I defer to Neil. That's a question for Neil.
Yeah, let me just say that I think it's actually not just simply a question of AI. I think this the issue of the distinction between subjective and objective is kind of goes right the way back in throughout architectural history in many ways. I think the problems a lot of architects have is they talk about the world just in purely objective ways, that this is a building kind of thing, without realizing that within cultural theory, everything is kind of filtered through the subjective interpretations. And I think we saw what AI brings up is precisely some of those issues already, how we kind of construct the world subjectively. The person I would say who's really interesting here is Judith Butler. She talks about performativity. Now we have performativity in terms of material behavior. That's one expression of performativity, but there's also a performativity in terms of personal identity. In other words, what she's arguing, it's very interesting in terms of material body. She's saying, I mean, Judith Butler's fantastically interesting. I like along with Slavoj Žižek, she's probably the leading intellectual around today, but her argument, which is kind of it's a feminist argument. She's a kind of lesbian theorist. And she's saying, because I've got a female body with two breasts, that doesn't mean to say I have to be heterosexual. I can reinvent myself as well, or I can, through my performativity, through my operations, my iterative operations, I can define myself as who I want to be, and that doesn't have to necessarily conform to all those models of the past. And this opens up a lot of possibilities. You know, I think, for example, Pierre Bourdieu talks about habitus, how the world is what it is because of how people have behaved. What Judith Butler is saying is sure, but then we can reinvent things by introducing different traditions, different ways of operating, different performativities. So I think the whole question is, she goes much deeper than just AI. It really needs to be brought into architectural discourse, how the subjective, it kind of colors how we view the object. So all I would say is Judith Butler, but at the same time, just to finish off, she does have a book, Bodies That Matter, where she's saying, sure, we can't just talk about performativity. You have to take on board the materiality of the body itself. But I think it's a really important kind of distinction she makes. And the notion of performativity is a really beautiful concept. So I would encourage you to have a look at her. I wrote something about that. I'll put there. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I have Marina Rodriguez. So, Marina, you're on.
Hello, sorry, because I didn't know how to raise the hand, so I was trying to.
No problem.
Okay, so I was thinking in relation with this idea of collaborative authorship, and which includes in a way users and also the implications of times in matter and in the environment, and how can this involve multiple actions and more than a language and more than a message. And in this way, could we say that in those cases, architecture moves from the human decision to a plane of own consistency and maybe singularity? And following that question, the next question could be what buildings do, no, in a plane of controversies and which is involved more than more dimension than the formal dimension, no, and time dimension, dynamic dimension.
Good question. First, I'm not necessarily an advocate, of completely collaborative design with the users, etc. But let's go back to what I said about architecture is a conversation. I do believe that. So it's not necessarily about the future inhabitants designing, their home, co-designing with the architect. It might not be necessarily that, but there need to be a conversation, which often does not happen. And then I would say that most of our conversation, we need actually objects. One of the reasons, somebody I did not quote in my talk today, but I really like, it's a philosopher, used to be a philosopher of science, French guy called François Dagonnier. And he wrote actually the best way to understand the mind might be not necessarily to scrutinize the mind, but actually to think of all these material objects that surrounds us, in which so many human things are deposited. So I think rather than thinking of architecture as having, I'm quoting what you wrote on the chat, a plane of consistency of its own, why don't we think, and that's a little bit what Latour is suggesting, although I have my nervosity about some aspect of Latour, that we do politics with humans, but also with objects, with systems, etc. And that ultimately architecture is a political arena. And that actually the conversation is a political conversation. You see what I mean? So instead of seeing it as a plane that would be suprahuman or extrahuman or etc., why don't we think that this is exactly what it means to be human, which is actually to be addressing each other through so many of these material mediations, which is the big difference between us and, for example, chimpanzee, etc., have they use objects, but far less, and etc., which is also why inhabiting is so precious, because inhabiting is actually something which doesn't point only to us, toward us, but toward the possibility to enter into a dialogue. Think of something as simple. You have a visitor in your home, and actually you show your home and you actually display something of yourself. And so I would say this is, for me, what architecture does. So it does not mean, so yes, it involves multiple author. That's to say, when you, for example, show your home, there is the person who is visiting with you, yourself, the designer who's designed the home, the way you've actually furnished it, etc. So you realize there are a lot of actors, etc. Somebody who's written in a Latourian way interesting things on that is Albena Yaneva.
Yes.
Although she tends, by the end, architecture get lost a little bit in the story, which is a little bit my concern sometimes with actor network theory, etc., is that you completely lose the design. So, and I am still interested in what it means to practice architecture, what it means to try to imagine spaces that other can inhabit. So
Could I chip in something very briefly, Antoine?
no,
I
very
think,
briefly is not
very
a notion
briefly.
you're able of, Neil.
Very briefly.
So very briefly, if you're beyond 1 minute, that's not very brief.
Okay. So I think we need to take into account how a building is activated by users. This is something that Bernard Schumi talks about. And if you think about that, you can take that, extrapolate this idea about identity as being a form of performance or performativity, and think about how a building accrues a certain identity by association through the performativity of what's going on in that particular kind of space. So for example, the architectural association used to be a house, and it's in a square where most of the other buildings are now offices. But is it precisely through the kind of activities that take place there, the kind of activities associated with the School of Architecture, that it accrues a certain association to do with a School of Architecture? And that, to my mind, is really where the political lies in architecture, by association. I think the building itself is pretty inert. It can afford certain possibilities and not others, but that's the limitation of what I think architecture can do. 1 minute?
No, you're more than a minute, but that's okay. Yeah, that's still very reasonable. Marrikka, do you want to jump in? Because you've been very, thank you, Marina. Actually, I don't agree with you. I think this is an impoverished version, but nevertheless, Marrikka.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just thank you, Antoine. I just only wanted to make one point, which I'm sure we agree on, but I didn't see it very clearly, or didn't hear it very clearly expressed in what you presented, which is that, of course, there is an intense materiality to the digital and to the forms of automated intelligence that are beginning to appear. So it isn't the case, actually, that one form of intelligence would be disembodied and the other is still embodied, but actually there may be different units of that embodiment, some of them more alien for us to grasp than others. And the reason I think it's important for us to take that into account is because one of the things that I see emerging as a trend in the way that we relate to these other forms of intelligence, however primitive they are, and however pre-coded they remain at this moment in time, is that it's becoming harder and harder for us to kind of get to the back of them, right? Like, and it used to be the case, just to use a really, classic example, that one could easily get under the hood of one's car, right? So if you had a kind of technical, basic kind of technical ability or a technical education, you could fix your own car if something broke, or you could understand where things were. Even cars, which are still pretty clunky machines, are beginning to be difficult to read. They're beginning to be more opaque. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it brings a kind of glimmer of mystery and enchantment and magic to our interactions with these other things that, as you say, help to constitute our subjectivity. But we also have to remember that they're also embodied and they have their own forms of materiality. And if we forget that, then I think we potentially lose control of them, and we end up creating these non-aesthetic spaces, these non-aesthetic sort of wastelands, like the Amazon warehouse or like the Gigafactory, for instance, into which design cannot penetrate, and along with it, into which human judgment cannot enter. Because of course, I think I said this before, of course, we need to, this is important, something that architects know very well, maybe better than other fields, the link between aesthetic judgment and ethical judgment.
I agree and disagree slightly, to be honest. That the digital is very strongly material. Yes, there are cables, there are servers, there are a lot of stuff, etc. That I agree. That said, you can imagine that AI, there is one thing which is to have a material base, another is to have a body. And you can imagine an AI that is it will be necessarily material. So far, we haven't reinvented ether. So it has to be material in one way or another, but it may very well, which goes back to when I quoted Malebranche, you may imagine an AI which is not attached, that may circulate in an endless series of cables, circuits, machine servers, etc., and that is not trapped into a body. Because, you know, part of our freedom, but we're also trapped in our body. So I think we can imagine an AI that moves on, you know, just like a car moving on the freeway system. So that would be a completely different kind of experience of the world. And that is too early. So that's why actually I do agree that the digital, and by the way, the digital consumes a lot of, you know, burns a lot of energy, etc. So the digital is definitely material, don't deny that. But AI, by the end, you know, the form of relation to matter that it may have one day may be very different from the way we think, because once again, we have a body, which is very different. So that would be probably my point of disagreement with you, that beware, we may imagine very different, you know, which is one of the oldest fiction about also God, which is, you know, we may imagine that every point in space is actually part of God, and that God is actually distributed in the entire world. Old theological speculation. But you know, you can, which is why so many people, by the way, are actually have a godlike vision of AI, because you can imagine fantasies like that, which you find also in Hollywood film, you know, Terminator. At some point, you know, I don't remember the name of the super intelligence thing, but it's a little bit like that. You cannot trap it in a machine, whatever, it escapes. It's co-present everywhere.
Antoine, can I just
Sure.
Very briefly,
Sure.
I'll give my
No, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mistake to think that digital is material. The digital is not material. If you look at a building is completely analog. You know, I think a lot of people confuse this. It's not it. Now, that's the digital is basically software. You know, and essentially it depends upon hardware. You have to use hardware. You've got to use the cables and so on.
No, I think we disagree. You're an idealist. You're a Cartesian, actually.
Well, no, but I think one way to get around this thing is to understand it is to the French term numérique. I mean, so it's numbers. I mean, are numbers material? I don't think so. You know, so I think that's one way to think about it. So maybe we'll disagree on this thing.
My God, Neil, it took all these Deleuzian layers to be finally discarded to see the hardcore traditionalist in you. I don't think, can you separate the digital from its material support? Don't you think it's returned to a kind of Aristotelian form and matter, as if the digital was a form that was actually materialized? I'm scared for you that, you know, somebody who wrote so eloquently on Deleuze is actually recreating Aristotle.
Well, I don't think
it's a totally Aristotelian vision of the digital.
Okay, let me just articulate. I think we need to make a distinction between information, and I think the digital is information, right? Information and form, and often form should be informed by information by performative questions, of course. So they're all together in some senses. But I guess what I think.
I think I trapped you there. I think you're going to try to escape because you're quite astute, but you're trapped.
Let me give you one example. I think the way we should understand the digital, the term CNC milling machine, that gives it away. Computer numerically controlled. What computation does is control the drilling bit, but the drilling bit is completely analog.
That's a completely idealistic vision of information, as if information was completely distinct from its support, which is actually
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking actually, Neil, you're old-fashioned on that, you know.
No, not old-fashioned. No,
totally old-fashioned. I have to confess, for once, you know, usually I'm the old-fashioned one, but there, you revealed something very dark about you. No, I'm joking. But seriously, don't you think that precisely an ideology to believe that the information is distinct from its support.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
as if, you know, because, you know, a series of 0 and 1, which is the greatest ideology of the digital, is precisely that whether the 0 and 1 are carved in wood, inscribed in marble, or in magnetic tape, it's still the same information. But that's pure idealism, because guess what? You've never seen the digital function with marble plates. So it's like numbers, you know, you can have these, yes, but then you return to a kind of Platonic assessment that the triangle exists as an essence, as an idea. This is precisely what you've said. So it's actually worse than Aristotle. It's back to Plato.
No. That's not at all.
I'm sorry.
Not essential.
But
Sorry, it's completely idealistic.
Also, I think but I think you betray your position actually, because in order to make it, you have to go to linguistic traditions to do so. So you're proving your idealism because you're resorting to terms. So it's about the deep meaning of information, or the acronym of a CNC milling machine. The position, if the position is already pre-coded in certain linguistic traditions, then it is an idealistic position.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I get a real confusion recently by some books about the digital that assumes that the digital is material. I think that's completely wrong. And the fact I have to use words, you know, there are plenty of examples. I'm
a bit surprised by somebody who read the Lambda to hear that there are things which are not material.
Yes. I think we have to see.
Because you just told us that, you know, the Lambda had profoundly struck you, etc. And, you know, one of the things in the kind of new materialism that he represented, like so many others, is that there is no such thing as a pure realm, because then ideas will pre-exist matter, which is back to Plato. Once again, the triangle pre-exists any given transcription of the triangle in matter. Or it could be Aristotle, that's to say there is a triangle as, you know, a form that is then embodied in this or that triangle. And that's precisely, and I think, you know, this is what, when I spoke of the nostalgia, I think the digital, one of the risks is actually to go back to this kind of thing, which is what programming sometimes would, because can you separate, because truth is, we've never, you know, one of the problems, by the way, with Babbage, that he would never have been able to make his differential engine function, because with cogs and gears, it could not function. So it means that actually programming is linked to the material. It's not linked to, you know, I don't want to do a kind of German media theorist gig, but still they have a point. You know, a door is not an ID. A door is made of material, is made of a lot of things, etc. And programming is not an idea. It's something that is dependent on certain material devices. And
I'm not an idealist, and I certainly don't go back to Aristotle.
Yeah, well, why don't you accept to be an old-fashioned idealist for once? You know,
I do think if we just
I love that.
If you just take the way in, I mean, I think Butler is so interesting, and she is really very, very new recently anyway. The idea that matter is inscribed within certain performances and so on, certain behaviors, identities, and so on, then we can separate out some of these ideas. So the idea that a building has an identity, it's based on the performances going on there, not the materiality of the building itself. But I don't want to get too lost in this, but I don't think I'm being nostalgic in this sense, but we maybe could.
Well, because you know your problem, Neil, by the end is that you want too much to be on the forefront. And that's risky, because being on the forefront, you may then reveal that actually you're a very old-fashioned Platonist. Just, you know, of course you're in the trench with a young soldier, but guess what? Because actually that was a completely idealistic take. And I do think that's one of the greatest risks of the digital, which is why, by the way, you have all these pathos about the craftsman, etc., and Sanford about the body, etc., because actually that's the biggest threat behind that. And behind that, we may be afraid by the end. Actually, you're not afraid of God. That's good, because that's God who can live in the realm of pure essence. So
I don't know if God exists personally. I don't necessarily believe in God, but
anyway, that was an interesting exchange. Yeah, even before Babbage, someone wrote, is linked to the material through weaving. Absolutely. You know, I think numbers, you know, and by the way, you mentioned numérique, but what is interesting is that digits are linked to the hand.
yeah, but I think we've got to be careful of distinguishing metaphors from things themselves.
No, but I do think that, you know, our abstractions are inseparable from a material basis, without which they would have no relevance, you know. So I think, once again, things do not exist in a pure realm of ideas. I'm surprised, once again, for a materialist. It's French, it's a Cartesian. You're a Cartesian behind which an Aristotelian, behind which a Platonist is actually hidden. You're back to your Renaissance roots.
I'm not sure that I would subscribe to those categories,